There are two important things you need to know about security in PHP. And they are, you need to filter input and you need to escape output. And really, with those two key things, the tools that you use, the way that you do it, is kind of irrelevant, but those are the cornerstones, those are the important concepts. Filtering input means being a bit suspicious about data wherever it's come from. We always think about checking for valid form inputs, but we also need to be careful about things like query parameters and even data that comes back from databases or third-party APIs. We need to be really careful regardless where that data is coming from. Always take care to filter your input. PHP has a filter extension that I'm going to cover in this section. Escaping output is equally important, understanding that you need to format your data correctly so that it's safe for wherever you're outputting it to. When you're sending to a web page, you need to be careful that you're not allowing script injection there and that all your characters will be displayed correctly on an HTML page. You don't want to format for HTML if you're outputting to JSON, because that would be just annoying for whoever's trying to consume that data. Something we often forget is outputting. We're also outputting when we output to a database. So we need to make sure that we're escaping all of our values correctly and formatting things so that they can be stored correctly in our storage backends. I'm going to talk more about databases in the PDO section of this course. Two particular parts that I want to talk about in terms of security in PHP, and the first is the filter extension. This is not new. The filter extension has been available since PHP 5.2 and it includes some fantastic built-in features. You might be old enough to remember that terrible enormous regex that we used to copy out of one of the pair extensions to validate email. It's all built in and it's very easy to use. Filter allows us to either sanitize or validate our values. Sanitize means literally to make sane. So to sanitize would be to keep the good bits and throw away what doesn't work. So you might throw away some bad characters or you might throw away the tags that you're not allowing. The validate filters, in contrast, will either the whole value is acceptable or it isn't and you get nothing. So for example, if a user has a bad character in their password, it makes no sense to sanitize it because then they gave you a password and you've thrown away one character, they're never going to be able to log in. The validate, again for email, your email address is valid or it's not. It doesn't make any sense to perform surgery on an email. For a comment field, it does make sense to sanitize. Just keep the good words and throw away the extra stuff. We have a selection of really excellent filters and they're quite nice and flexible. I'm going to show you some examples. Crucially, filter also includes validation for URLs and for email. So both of those we don't need to regex. We've got built-in ways of doing this. Smart people have solved this problem for us, which I love. In addition to the filter extension, you might also, for example, if you know it's a number, you might just typecast and say this is an int. If it is a number, it'll come through correctly, and if it's not, you'll throw it away. Other examples are only allowing certain values. So perhaps using a switch case or an array of allowed values. That's a whitelist. The opposite to a whitelist is a blacklist, where you have a list of disallowed values. The whitelist is much more restrictive because you can only allow values that you've already thought of. But the blacklist is probably a little bit less secure because I find that malicious attempts on PHP scripts are usually all one step ahead of even the good blacklists. So let's have a look at some examples using filter. Here I have one where I have a couple of incoming fields and I've written a filter which will deal with those for me. So I'm looking to populate a clean data array using the filter input array function which comes with filter. So filter input array allows me to set up a series of rules applying to a whole input. So here I'm filtering the post input, my user filled in a form, right? For the name field, I want you to sanitize the string. And you can customize the rules about what's allowed and not within sanitize. The email field, it has to be validate. Either it's a valid email or it's not. and it makes no sense to sanitize. Whatever I get out of this process of filter input array, I'll then var dump so that we can inspect it. So let's look what happens when I call this with some actual values. Here it is with being called from curl. So curl is making a post request to my script, and I'm sending the name Fred and the email Fred. Have a look at the output. Fred comes through fine as a name, but it's not a valid email address. And because we set it up as a validate filter, I actually get false in response. It wasn't valid, so the data is just false. It was invalid. If I correct that email address on my next request, so I send fred@example.com, which is a valid email address, conforms with the spec, then the name still comes back as Fred and the email comes back, it is valid, so I get that email value in its entirety. Using filter with its built-in features is a really good way of checking that the values that come in are what you expect. If you're using a framework with built-in form validation, then you'll probably find that behind the scenes you can find use of the filter extension lurking underneath somewhere. Definitely recommended for checking values as you filter the input to your application.